It's August 17th, 1943, just another day for the men of the U.S. Army Air Corps in England. Dawn breaks over the mist-shrouded countryside of East Anglia to reveal a scene of bustling activity. Ground crewmen hurry about making last-minute preparations for the day's mission. Bombs are loaded, engines are tuned, machine guns are cleaned, while every round of ammunition is checked and rechecked. In nearby Quonset huts, thousands of aviators anxiously await the start of today's briefing. Silently, they pray that they'll be given a milk run, perhaps a rail yard in France or a German airfield in Belgium. But when their grim-faced commanders step before them, they know that today's mission will be a rough one. It was a modern marvel, armed with 13 machine guns and capable of flying 2,000 miles or more with its load of deadly explosives tucked inside its bomb bay. The world had never seen such power in an aircraft, and only the most advanced nation could have even conceived of such a destructive weapon. Each flying fortress carried aloft 6 miles of electrical wiring within its metal frame. Its generators could light all the rooms in a good-sized hotel. Each B-17 carried enough steel for 160 washing machines and enough aluminum for 50,000 percolators. The rubber used in its wing deicers could retread almost 1,000 automobile tires. Each B-17 cost almost $500,000, a huge sum for the time. The B-17 was truly an American weapon, complex, expensive, huge, larger than life. And it had been built for a uniquely American role, daylight precision bombing, a role that was hoped would shorten the war by knocking out factories vital to Germany's war effort. And on this day in August of 1943, the B-17s and their crews would set out to prove that they could get the job done. Far from a milk run to France, the targets for today would be the Regensburg Messerschmitt plant and the ball bearing factories around Schweinfurt.
Schweinfurt had dozens and dozens of ball bearing plants and factories around the city. In fact, Schweinfurt produced between 30 and 40% of all the ball bearings used by Germany and its allies. So the philosophy was, if you could knock out the ball bearing factories around Schweinfurt, the German Army and Air Force, actually, and Navy, would grind to a halt because they wouldn't have ball bearings, which was a key component to any mechanical item.
The 8th Air Force would be sticking its head right into the Tiger's jaws, and the Tiger would be waiting. With the briefing concluded, the bomber crews climb aboard trucks and jeeps for the short drive to their own flying forts. The B-17s are ready to go. The mechanics and armorers have worked through the night to make sure that every bomber is fit to fly. The plan calls for 2 groups of bombers to coordinate their attacks on Regensburg and Schweinfurt. The 4th Bomb Wing's 139 B-17s would go in first, hitting the Messerschmitt factory, then flying on to North Africa in an effort to confuse the German defenses. Meanwhile, close behind the 4th Bomb Wing would come the 1st Bomb Wing's 222 flying fortresses. They would sneak in behind the 4th and destroy the ball bearing factories around Schweinfurt. Bad weather ruined the plan. The Luftwaffe almost ruined the mission. The B-17s form up over England before heading out toward Germany. The 4th bomb wing is already 90 minutes late. They'll be lucky to reach North Africa by sundown. As the first 139 bombers cross into Belgium, the second wave of bombers still hasn't even left the ground back in East Anglia. In fact, the first bomb wing would be delayed 5 hours. The attackers would go in piecemeal, and the Luftwaffe would tear them to pieces. The 4th bomb wing is attacked first. Scores of German Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s rip into the bomber form. Now shot up and shocked are the crews that they scatter their bombs all over the city. The ball bearing factories are hit, but not knocked out.
The area where the ball bearing industry is located was definitely, for first impression, devastated. But as I walked from the airbase, there was no public transportation in Schweinfurt at that time, to the railroad station. I noticed that certain sections of the big factory, there was still steam coming out. They were still operating, still working.
Some of the bombers reach East Anglia with 1 or 2 engines out. They crash land on any available airfield as ambulances and fire trucks race toward their shattered hulks. By the dozen, wounded airmen are precision daylight bombing, the very reason the B-17 had been invented in the first place, had failed in the face of Germany's deadly air defenses. Still, the 8th Air Force's leadership would not give up. The bombers would soon fly again. The bloody losses over Regensburg and Schweinfurt can be traced back to the U.S. Army Air Corps' concept of strategic bombing that evolved during the 1920s. After the brutality and trauma of World War I, military strategists began to look for ways to avoid the horrible stalemate of trench warfare. Air power advocates such as Hugh Boom Trenchard, Julio Duhay, and Billy Mitchell believed that the next war would see another tragic deadlock on the ground. With the land armies trapped in the morass of trench warfare again, the only route to victory would be through the air. Trenchard and Duhay believed that by sending vast fleets of bombing planes to destroy enemy cities, a nation could be forced to surrender. These terror raids would cause civilian morale to break, destabilizing a nation and possibly even causing a revolution. With the enemy government collapsing at home, its armies would not be able to continue the fight. American air power advocates didn't like the idea of randomly killing civilians. Instead, they decided that the best way to victory would be to knock out the enemy's ability to produce the weapons of war. By destroying arms factories, aircraft assembly plants, ball bearing plants, and other such strategic targets, an enemy's Army and Air Force wouldn't have the means to carry on the fight. They would be forced to surrender as their nation's wartime economy crumbled under the weight of this precision bombing campaign. American air leaders fervently believed that such a bombing campaign could bring swift success at a low cost. By throwing everything into such an effort, the attrition of trench warfare could be avoided and total victory could be achieved. It wasn't until 1935 that the Americans developed a bomber capable of carrying out such a grandiose strategy.
Well, the B-17 was a 4-engine heavy bomber designed in the mid-1930s by the Boeing Aircraft Corporation. And its primary role was to destroy enemy industrial targets through high-altitude precision bombing. And in that role, it was uniquely suited. It turned out to be one of the best aircraft probably ever built for the role that it was designed for. Mainly because, first off, at high altitudes, the B-17 was an amazingly stable aircraft. The reason for that was the fact that it had a very large wing. With a large wing area, the plane was very stable in flight. It was an excellent bombing platform. And most importantly to the crews was the fact that because it was stable, they could fly in very tight formations, so they could stick together.
The Boeing Model 299, prototype of the Flying Fortress, flew for the first time in August of that year. It would take several more years of development before the first production models reached operational squadrons, but when they did, they were the best and most modern bombers in the world. For its time, the B-17 was huge. With its 100-foot wingspan and 70-foot length, it towered over other late 30s aircraft. Later versions, including the B-17G, came equipped with 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines that cranked out 5,520 total horsepower. And the Fortress needed every bit of power to drag aloft its typical bomb load of 14 500-pound bombs over a distance of 3,600 miles. Top speed was about 290 miles per hour, but in tight formations and heavily loaded, the Boeing cruised at about 170. With its heavy defensive armament of 13 machine guns, the Air Corps believed that the B-17 could successfully fight off enemy interceptors without help from escorting fighters. This was a major issue as the Air Corps didn't have any fighter aircraft capable of flying long distances with the bombers. But since the Flying Fortress had so many 50 and 30 caliber machine guns, such a long-range escort fighter seemed unnecessary. The B-17s would strike their targets alone, flying in tight, mutually protecting formations. In 1943, the 8th Air Force unleashed its first sustained bombing campaign against Germany. Codenamed Operation Point Blank, the B-17s were sent to knock out the Third Reich's aircraft industry. By destroying the Luftwaffe's production centers, the 8th Air Force would gain control of the air over Europe. With that in hand, the bombers could be sent against other strategic targets, striking at the heart of the Reich's ability to wage war. Point Blank was the first clash between the American pre-war doctrine and the realities of modern air combat. The results were soon clear, but the Americans doggedly persisted in putting their theories into practice at the expense of thousands of brave young men.
About the time we dropped the bombs, we started losing oil. Waited till there was not enough oil pressure. We couldn't feather the engine. So then they windmill just from the air. And eventually they may twist the shaft off and the prop will come off. God knows where it'll go. Or they can shake a wing loose, I guess. Not a very good situation. And I don't remember if it was in that engine or another one, the fire started. I don't know if they got that one out or not. And apparently the underside of the 17 was pretty well shot up. Sort of dropped out of the formation and started losing altitude. And wasn't too long till the pilot rang the bailout bell. And that was it for that mission.
The most important flaw in the precision daylight bombing campaign was the lack of a long-range escort fighter. Even the B-17's numerous defensive guns could not protect it from determined German fighter attack. The Luftwaffe soon learned to hit the B-17 formations from the front, which proved to be the weak point in the Boeing's defensive systems. Sometimes 40 or 50 Me-109s or FW-190s would swoop down at the bombers in a blazing head-on pass, aiming for the cockpit and engines. Nothing could stop such devastating attacks, and the fortresses took appalling losses.
Our biggest concern, really, in all honesty, were the young men that were over there before I got there. They had a lot of fighters that they had to contend with. The average mission completions that they had, I think, was about 7. And here we finished 35, so that tells you something right there.
If you lost an engine, or if you feathered an engine, that was very apparent to the Germans. And they'd pick on you right now. And they like to make holes in a formation. If they could knock a plane out of formation, you were definitely crippled. They knew how to do that.
And go home that year. An average crew flew 5 to 7 missions before getting shot down. Some who flew longer usually came home more than once with a shot-up bomber and injured crewmen aboard. Randall Jarrell, an 8th Air Force airman, wrote a poem that captured all the horror and intensity he and his fellow Flying Fortress crews faced in a piece titled The Death of a Ball Turret Gun. From my mother's sleep, I fell into the state, and I hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze. 6 miles from Earth, loosed from its dream of life, I woke to black flak in the nightmare fighters. When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose. Such losses had a profound effect on morale and on the emotional health of the remaining B-17 crews. With buddies going down on every mission, the men became fatalistic. They clung to good luck charms and became increasingly superstitious. Others gradually lost their combat edge as battle exhaustion wore them out. In some cases, men broke down entirely and became psychiatric casualties. About 4% of all 8th Air Force losses in World War II were psychiatric cases. These were men who performed their duty admirably till the stress and strain of constant combat finally broke their emotional back. Such men were called flak happy by their peers, or said to have the Focke-Wulf jitters.
During the war, the 8th Air Force suffered roughly 50,000 KIA, WIA, and MIA. Tremendous amount of guys lost their lives or were physically injured. But also, as the stress and strain of combat began to manifest themselves on these crews, it became clear that the 8th Air Force was going to have to do something about psychiatric casualties. They were starting to lose crews, starting to lose pilots, starting to lose gunners to emotional trauma. And so one of the things that the 8th Air Force did was they set up a series of rest homes for crews that had been through particularly horrendous ordeals. Or later on in the war, they were sent there just as a matter of course. These were called flak leaves, and they'd go back to these country manors way out of the way from any military installations, and they would be able to eat and relax, and that actually helped get some of the emotional problems that the crews were suffering under control. Now, this never threatened operations for the 8th Air Force. It was always a very small number of the crews. Wartime reports had it that of every 1,000 men that flew combat with the 8th Air Force, 42 were going to become psychiatric casualties of one sort or another. And they were called permanent psychiatric cases if they were not returned to flight duty within 15 days. During the war, about 4,000 airmen and pilots fell into this category.
Through these brutal months, the crews learned to love their B-17s. The Flying Fortress had a ruggedness that sometimes defied imagination. They came home with 2, sometimes 3 engines knocked out and great gaping holes torn in their aluminum skins. Controls shot away, landing gear ruined, hydraulics blown out, flaps gone, and chunks of wing or tail hacked out by cannon shells didn't stop the rugged Flying Fortress. They came home limping, shattered and ruined, but still able to get their crews safely on the ground one final time. Hundreds of B-17s would return to England, never to fly again. They would be dragged off to the boneyards, where their broken bodies would be picked clean of spare parts that could be used to keep the other planes flying. To their crews, these faithful planes were utterly beloved.
We've flown on 2 engines, but you're coming downhill. That makes a lot of difference. You don't have fuel, you don't have bombs, and you're coming downhill, and you can go long ways. But the old B-17 was a tough son of a gun. It can just get holes all over it, and it's still going to come back. The B-17 just had a great big old slab, and it flew real slow. And it wasn't real high compression, so it could take a lot of punishment.
One way the crews expressed their deep feelings toward their planes was through nose art.
Nose art had some significance. It was a means to personalize a very impersonal weapon. A military aircraft is not a very personal thing, especially when 12,000 of them just like it are flying around in the world. So this was their way, the crew's way, to put their unique stamp on their aircraft and make it their own. And once that happened, that aircraft ceased to become just a collection of metal bolts and welded pieces of aluminum. It became almost a living, breathing part of their integrated crew. And so when you talk to crews who had their own aircraft for an extended period of time, they feel very, very strongly, very passionately towards that airplane, especially the B-17s that were so faithful and so rugged. And the crews will talk about their aircraft almost as if they were people.
With worn-out crews and demoralized bomb groups, the 8th Air Force continued to attack targets in Germany even after the August 17th Regensburg-Schweinfurt debacle. While nearly half of the 8th Air Force had been knocked out in that one air battle, the Americans won 1,000 Me-109s in lost production. What the Americans didn't realize was that the German aircraft industry was expanding at such a tremendous rate that those 1,000 planes were insignificant. Never once during the war did the Germans suffer from a lack of interceptors. In October of 1943, the 8th Air Force launched another concerted effort against targets in Germany. On October 8th, the B-17s bombed Bremen, losing 30 out of 399 planes. The next day, 36 more B-17s were lost attacking aircraft factories at Ochelm and Marienbad. The missions continued, and the stress on the crews grew even worse. In 1 week, From October 2nd through the 9th, the Germans shot down or damaged beyond repair over 100 flying forts. The 8th Air Force lost almost 1,000 men. And still, the worst was yet to come. On October 10th, the B-17s struck Münster. The Luftwaffe bored in on the bombers, concentrating on the low squadrons of the 100th Bomb Group. Flying a straggly, loose formation, the 100th turned out to be easy meat. Within minutes, the entire group was virtually wiped out. Hitting Münster cost another 36 B-17s and over 300 Americans. The lesson from Münster was clear. Flying in loose formations would get many men killed.
There was one group that flew pretty scraggly formations, yes, elements or formations. Some of them consequently were hit harder than ours. Our group flew good, tight formations. They wanted the wing of the side plane tucked right in behind the wing and in the waist of the other. In other words, tight elements of three. By having those wings all tucked in, concentrating the firepower from all the guns aboard each ship, it was a pretty good deterrent that the Germans wouldn't come in too close and attack us. They liked to go after the disabled planes that had drifted off from them and got back here by themselves.
I think one reason that our group didn't have the casualties that some of the groups, some of the squadrons, is we were a little knot up there in the sky. I could always spot our group. It was just tight.
Then on October 14th, the crews assembled in the briefing rooms to learn they would be going after Schweinfurt once again. The news was received by a chorus of groans and shocked gasps amongst the exhausted crews. Still, they climbed aboard their B-17s to do their duty, knowing that today, many of them would not be coming home. They flew into a holocaust of flak and fighters. The Germans were waiting for them, and as soon as their short-ranged P-47 escorts turned for home, the 109s and 190s attacked. They swarmed through the B-17 formations, blasting the bombers out of the sky with cannons, rockets, and machine guns.
Well, we were going into the ball bearing plant at Schweinfurt, and it was pretty tough going. Heavy flak, being shot at from every direction, and I don't really know what happened, except some people in our squadron that saw us get shot down. But they said one of them rockets shot us. It was obviously a lost cause, and the pilot was losing it, and so they jump out, and I had the last shot that they hit us with had concussion had blown me back against the bulkhead and unplugged my oxygen and my intercom system. And I was a little while, when I finally come to, I realized I didn't hear anybody and my oxygen thing wasn't moving. And so we were only 18,000 feet that day. So I went back to the cockpit, and I was the only guy on that airplane. Everybody else had jumped out. And so I run back and snap my parachute on and jump out. They had this big thing that they'd been trying to stop with the Germans. Were shooting Americans in parachutes, and the Americans were shooting Germans in parachutes. And both sides were trying to stop it. And here come two ME-109s right at me. They kept getting closer and closer. When they got almost up to me, they reared up like that and circled right tight around me, and both of them saluted. So I saluted, and they went away. And so I just landed in second growth timber, which was no harder than jumping off the bed.
As the raid drove deeper into Germany, the Luftwaffe responded by throwing everything that could fly into the air at them. Even obsolete Ju-87 Stukas attacked the B-17s, dropping aerial bombs into their tight formations. One bomb group, the 305th, lost 12 planes out of its 27 before even reaching the target area. Those B-17s that reached Schweinfurt dropped their bombs as best they could through a growing pall of smoke that partially obscured the ball bearing factories. Entire groups missed their targets and their bombs fell all over the countryside. So many German fighters had attacked the flying forts that most of the American gunners were now running out of ammunition. Meanwhile, the German 109 and 190 squadrons were able to land to rearm and refuel in time to attack the bombers again. Low on ammo, the desperate bomber crews turned for home and endured hour after hour of deadly fighter attack and beyond the breaking point. Of the 229 B-17s sent out that day, 60 were shot down, 7 were written off, and 138 more were damaged. Over 630 men of the mighty 8th were either killed, wounded, or captured. In 2 weeks of operations that October, the 8th Air Force had lost over 200 bombers, nearly half its total force. Worse, there was little to show for the terrible casualties. Something had to be done, or the Germans would win the air war. The Army Air Corps had learned its lesson. It was time to throw the pre-war book away and figure out a new way to hit the Germans. The war would not be won with a quick knockout blow against Germany's wartime industries. Rather, it would take a long, sustained campaign to meet 8th Air Force's objectives. And to sustain such an operation, the bombers would need long-range fighter escort.
Well, initially, the 8th Air Force only had P-47 groups available. And they had a very limited range. They could only get to just about the German frontier and back. So they were not able to escort the bombers all the way to target. That posed an increasing problem as the Luftwaffe caused more and more casualties to the 8th Bomber Command. So during the summer of 1943, the 8th Air Force began investigating the use of drop tanks, external fuel tanks that could be slung underneath the fuselage and the wings of their P-47s. So they got very large fuel tanks, up to 108-gallon tanks, I believe, is among the ones that they used. And that was actually able to extend the P-47's radius of action by 100 miles. So they were able to actually go inside Germany and actually could get 375 miles out from England and back. So that had a major effect on the air war, because the P-47s now didn't have to just turn around over Belgium. They could actually tangle with the Luftwaffe over Germany. But at the same time, after the second Schweinfurt raid, the 8th Air Force began demanding long-range fighters. And of course, the only one that was available at the time was the P-38. So in October of 43, the very first P-38s began escorting the bombers, and while they were not as effective as the P-47 or later the P-51, the 38s could at least provide some protection for the bombers, and they could actually go to Berlin and back.
With winter closing in, the 8th Air Force...
The air war had changed. We were no longer trying to avoid the Luftwaffe. The 8th Air Force's primary mission was destroy the Luftwaffe before D-Day. And to do that, we had to draw them out. And the only way to draw them out was to pick targets that the bombers could go after that were significant enough to the Germans to get them to defend it. And so really the bombing campaign became less an issue of destroying targets on the ground as it was drawing the Luftwaffe into a fight so the long-range fighter escort could take them out.
The flying fortresses had become bait. At the end of February 1944, a 5-day break in the winter weather allowed the 8th Air Force to launch attacks deep into Germany against aircraft factories and airfields. The Luftwaffe rose to the defense and waded into the bomber stream with a vengeance. But then the Lightnings, Thunderbolts, and Mustangs protecting the B-17s pounced on the Germans, savaging their ranks. While the bombers took heavy losses, the Luftwaffe's interceptor units were badly mauled during the week-long battle. 2 weeks later, the 8th Air Force went after Berlin. On the 6th of March, the Germans managed to down 69 B-17s over Berlin. In doing so, however, the Luftwaffe broke its own back. As they desperately tried to defend the Nazi capital, the 109s and 190s were set upon by American fighters and blasted from the sky. On March 8th, the B-17s returned to Berlin, and once again a violent battle raged. When it was over, the German interceptor force had been crippled.
Somebody yelled, lightnings! And I looked around. My gosh, there I saw the lightnings. And they came down, and all of a sudden, I saw streamers go by. I said, oh boy, somebody's at my tail. And I went a little lower, and by that time, I heard a loud bang, and he had cut off part of the right wing, and I just cut it and instinctively put her down.
When the 8th Air Force returned to Berlin the next day, hardly a German fighter was seen, much to the delight of the bomber crews. For the next 3 months, the battle of attrition played out in all its bloody finality. The Germans lost more pilots than they could possibly replace, while the American units were reinforced regularly and never suffered from a shortage of crews. It was a race to see which side would die faster and which side would run out of warm bodies to throw into the fray. It was a race the Germans could not win. From Big Week to the end of May 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 28 of its top aces. During Big Week alone, the Luftwaffe lost 33% of its fighter force and 17.9% of its pilots defending the Reich. March proved even worse for the Germans, as they lost fully 56% of their fighter aircraft and 22% of their remaining pilots while trying to defend Berlin. Such casualties could not be sustained. The Germans started the year with 2,283 available fighter pilots. By May, 2,262 had been killed or wounded, a 99% loss rate. The Luftwaffe was being bled white, and it was the 8th Air Force that was causing the bleeding. While Allied fighters blasted the Luftwaffe from the sky, the bombers still had targets to hit. Former B-17 crewman Les Hardy takes us on a typical mission deep within the heart of the Third Reich.
They'd wake you up probably 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, and run you down for chow, breakfast, and we didn't get eggs. Somewhere I read that on a combat day you got real eggs. They missed us. We got those powdered eggs, but the cooks did a good job on them. And then by the time you went through briefing and got your flying gear on, your heated suits, you had to wear heated suits or you'd freeze to death up there. And then assembled out at your airplane and got the information from your officers if they had anything. The navigator would usually tell us what the weather was supposed to be over the target. And then we'd form up over England, which was quite often dangerous because it might be you might be going through clouds. It was very foggy. They didn't even attempt it, but it wasn't unusual to have air-to-air collisions while you head across the channel. And you were stuck in that airplane for quite a few hours when you went to Berlin. Nothing to eat. I think they gave us a candy bar. One time they gave us an orange. That works real good at 28,000 feet, 60 below. We could have thrown those at the enemy. Getting to Berlin, quite often we'd encounter flak because they had their 88s mounted on rail cars and trucks, and they moved them around, and I swear they knew where we were what our flight pattern was. Because quite often we'd get flak on the way, and you didn't dodge around it. You had to stay on your course. But as you approached Berlin, if some other group was ahead of you, the air was black with flak, and that's what you had to fly through. On the bomb run, the bombardier, the pilot turned the thing on autopilot, so the bombardier controlled the airplane on the flight over the target, because he's the one that's aiming the Sperry at the ground. So he just flew through that like that was the only way to go. And it was very exciting. I'd like to have been able to shoot at something, but of course I couldn't do that. I could see plenty good through the top of my radio shack. It was wide open. The two little windows on the side weren't very good for seeing things, but I could see enough. Probably all I wanted to.
With the Luftwaffe on its knees, the 8th Air Force turned its attention to supporting the D-Day invasion and subsequent campaign in Normandy. The flying fortresses hit coastal emplacements and other targets along the beaches just prior to the landings, then took part in carpet bombing operations against German troops. One such mission virtually destroyed the German Panzer Lehr Division in July of 1944 and helped pave the way for the American breakout from the beachhead. Once the Allied armies broke out of Normandy and began driving toward Germany, the 8th Air Force turned to new targets in hopes of shortening the war. Up until early September of 1944, the heavy bombers had mainly attacked aircraft factories, U-boat assembly plants or pens, docks, and ball bearing factories. In May, the bombers had begun hitting oil refineries and synthetic fuel plants. D-Day delayed hitting any more of these targets until the fall of 1944, but in September, the mighty 8th returned to Germany and systematically destroyed the Reich's ability to process fuel. The attacks were an incredible success. By December, the 8th Air Force had knocked out almost half of Germany's refineries, precipitating a fuel crisis within the German army. Just when the Wehrmacht needed mobility the most, its panzers ground to a halt for want of oil and gas. Desperate measures were tried to get around this problem, including the construction of charcoal-burning engines that tanks could use, but they were too little, too late. The Flying Fortress had at last delivered the knockout punch the pre-war bomber advocates fervently believed it could do. At the same time, the 8th's bombers were used to attack marshalling yards and rail centers throughout Germany.
Mainly, most of my missions in those days were the marshalling yards. We were trying to destroy the transportation system so they couldn't move anything around by train. And we did. We really destroyed the area, because later on when I went to Germany, it took me 5 days to go on train, because they had to go all over the place, because they had to go where the tracks were still left. But that was mainly what we were doing at the end of the war, is bombing the tracks, train tracks, marshalling yards, destroying any moving stock. By the end of the war, most of everything that the Germans had was already destroyed. It was really destroyed.
The destruction of the Reich's rail net proved to be one of the Flying Fortress's most significant contributions to the war effort. German industry depended on the railroads to deliver raw materials and carry away finished products. By late 1944, the railroad system had all but collapsed under the weight of B-17-borne bombs. Even the barest necessities could not be transported effectively via rail by the end of 1944. Coal, the lifeblood of German industry, piled up near the mines with no way to get it to the factories that so badly needed it. By January, this caused a full-scale collapse of the German economy. And still, even as Nazi Germany twisted in its death throes, the B-17 crews continued to take heavy losses. No longer were German interceptors much of a threat. With thousands of bombers and thousands of fighters ranging across the Reich, the Luftwaffe had been all but swept from the skies. Flak, however, was a different matter entirely. The Germans concentrated hundreds of anti-aircraft batteries around crucial oil targets until some factories were defended by over 1,000 heavy guns. Using radar guidance, late-war German anti-aircraft fire brought down thousands of American aircraft, fighters, medium bombers, and even the high-flying B-17s.
There was another air raid in the afternoon, and here came the 8th American Air Force. I think it was a multi-effort because I think I counted over 90 planes or 100 planes, B-17s, and the German aircraft artillery apparently had them just right. All of a sudden I saw one bomber blow up and 9 parachutes and another one. And at one time I counted 27 parachutes.
Flak became the worst menace the B-17 crews faced.
Our biggest fear was the flak, because when I got there, we were really making strides on the ground, and we were pushing the Germans back, which time they're bringing all their flak guns back and concentrating them in the cities. So when we started into a target and you looked up ahead, it looked like a piece of white paper with a drop of ink drops down all over the paper. It was just a massive airspace of black flak bursts. And we were losing a lot of planes because of that, too.
It was a milk run, which is supposed to be an easy mission, just across the channel to a Luftwaffe airfield in, pretty sure it was France. Now, it could have been Belgium, but hard to remember. Anyhow, 3 airplanes. It was a big mission. And we went storming over there. I think we even left at a decent time in the morning. And as they say, a milk run, that means you're not supposed to have any trouble. Well, we didn't until we got over the target on our bomb run, and they cut loose with very accurate anti-aircraft fire. And we're plastering stuff all over us. We were flying on number 2 spot, the airplane on the starboard side of us. Took a hit, must have been oxygen tanks. And something got fire, and of course, fueled by oxygen, it's a holocaust. So we could see the guys, some of them bailing out. I don't remember how many chutes we saw. But what really impressed me, this plane kept flying right along beside us, and the pilot, who I had flown a practice mission with, tall, slim guy, real tall, he crawled out the pilot window because of the fire. I'm sure he couldn't get out. I don't know how a guy even got through that pilot window, and reached inside and got his parachute, chest back, and slid off of the wing. And I didn't know whether he got his chute on or not. In fact, it was reported that he did not. Later, well, a year or so later, I found out he had made it to the ground and no problem.
It was unbelievable. I couldn't register what I had seen or hadn't seen. We had our wingman right opposite us. We were in the target area and hadn't been hit ourselves. And all of a sudden, there was something that caught my attention on our right side. Looked over there, and the plane that was supposed to have been there wasn't there anymore. I looked around to see, well, maybe it went up a little higher, and I looked backwards, and there wasn't any behind. I looked down, and I couldn't find that plane's position. And I looked again, and I could see parts of the plane falling and gotten a direct hit. I guess must have been the whole charge or two from ACAC. Must have hit him right in the, blew him up. That was, there it was, and there it wasn't. I don't think there was a soul probably got out of that plane.
By the end of the war, over 12,000 B-17s had been produced. The B-17G, with its additional twin-gun chin turret, was the most numerous version with 8,680 being built. The 8th Air Force, which used the vast majority of the B-17's Boeing cranked out, lost 5,200 bombers during the war. Over 50,000 of the 8th Air Force's pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and radio operators were killed, wounded, or captured during the course of the strategic bombing campaign. Without the incredible ruggedness of the B-17, these shocking numbers would have been even higher. Was it worth it? For decades, historians have argued the pros and cons of the strategic bombing campaign in Europe. All agree that the B-17 didn't win the war against Germany alone, as the bombing advocates had theorized before the war, but the B-17 still played a key role in the victory over Hitler. The bombers wrecked Germany's oil industry, ensuring the defeat of the Wehrmacht by the Allied armies. More importantly, however, the B-17s drew out the Luftwaffe in the spring of 1944 during Big Week and the Berlin raids. In doing so, the bombers helped achieve complete air superiority over Western Europe as the German interceptor force ruined itself defending Berlin from the thousands of flying fortresses and the fighters the 8th Air Force was able to put into the air. This bloody victory set the stage for the Normandy invasion. For had the Allies not had complete control of the air, D-Day might never have taken place. When the war ended in Europe, the B-17's heyday came to an end. By 1945, the Flying Fortress was a 10-year-old design. Rugged, tough, and always a warrior, the B-17 nevertheless could not survive in a world that would soon see jet fighters, atomic weapons, and guided missiles. The 8th Air Force's 2,000 B-17s were collected together in fields all over England, where they were either flown back to the United States or scrapped on site. And thus, the B-17's last contribution may have been its most significant. These majestic planes were melted down and their metal used to help rebuild Western Europe. The destruction they had once wrought was repaired by their very skins. A noble end indeed. Today, only a few B-17s exist to remind future generations of the air war that raged so many years ago. Each flying fortress is a treasure, for they remain lonely signposts of the struggle that once raged in the bloody skies of Europe. Battles on land leave scars in the earth to mark their passage into history, but the sky over Europe reveals no secrets and tells no tales. The sky remains unchanged, unchangeable, as it had for the eons prior to those black-torn years of World War II. In these skies, titans once clashed. An epic struggle for survival unfolded amidst these clouds with stakes so high, entire nations would be destroyed. Young men by the hundreds of thousands were flung into the maelstrom of this desperate battle as the fighting reached its bitter climax. Over 60,000 young Americans and Germans would never return home. Their lives snuffed out in the air over Nazi-held Europe. In the end, through their courage to clamber aboard their faithful B-17s for mission after mission, these men of the mighty 8th Air Force helped free Europe from the dark tyranny of Hitler's Germany. Their legacy of freedom and of peace will never be forgotten.